Our next speaker, we've been privileged to have as Grand Prior of our Northern Lieutenancy for a number of years now. Archbishop Joseph Naumann was ordained a priest in 1975. He served as the Archdiocesan Pro-Life Coordinator from 1984 to 1995 and as Vicar General of the Archdiocese of St. Louis before being ordained as Auxiliary Bishop of St. Louis, Titular Bishop of Kaput-Shila, Archbishop will have to correct me, in 1997. He was appointed Administrator of the Archdiocese of St. Louis in 2003 and became the Archbishop for the Archdiocese of Kansas City and Kansas in 2005. Archbishop Naumann served on the USCCB as Chairman of the Pro-Life Committee from 2018 to 2021 and continues to serve on the Pro-Life Committee as a consultant. Archbishop is also Chair of the Kansas Catholic Conference and co-chair of the Religious Alliance Against Pornography. He is on the board of the National Committee for the Human Life Amendment and Grand Prior of the Northern Lieutenancy of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. Archbishop also serves on the Board of Trustees of the Kendrick McGlennon Seminary and Conception Seminary. I give you Archbishop Joseph Naumann.
Thanks, Sean. Thank you, and it's been a great afternoon, and I just for those that are being invested this year, you might be thinking, well, what does this have to do with the Holy Land? Well, as you're aware, there are two primary purposes of our organization, and one of those is to grow in personal holiness. And we can't really do the other mission well unless we do that first mission. And so we always like these annual meetings to take on the character of a retreat in many ways for our members. And I think you've been richly fed with the speakers today in terms of our own prayer life, and you've been briefed by the expert on the Eucharistic revival, Bishop Cousins. He was ordained a priest in 1997. I was ordained a bishop in 1997. I tell people I used to think anybody that was ordained a bishop for 25 years has to be really, really old. And I was right. It is true, but Bishop Cousins gives great hope for the Bishops' Conference. When you see some of the young bishops coming up, I tell people when he was named a bishop, it elevated the IQ of the Bishops' Conference by about 5 points. I sometimes at these meetings, people ask me, because oftentimes I talk about one of the books I've been reading. And one book that I read this past year that I would recommend to you is it's a book about an amazing priest, Father Aloysius Schwartz. It's called Priest and Beggar. I'm forgetting the author's name right now, but he became a priest in the 1950s. He first went to a diocesan seminary, but he had this desire to be a missionary, and so he went to the Maryknoll Seminary, which is this American order of missionaries, and he really liked their mission, but he felt that they lived too well. They lived in the missions, but more like Americans, and he wanted to live with the poor and as the poor. So he found this obscure order in Belgium, and which was a missionary order and fit that charism more. But it's a fascinating book about how he eventually becomes a priest for Korea in a Korean diocese after the Korean War, and experiences intense poverty there, but lives in the midst of this poverty, and the Lord uses him in amazing ways. And I was thinking this particularly here in Omaha, and I know many of you had the opportunity yesterday, I think, to visit Boys Town. And he actually established, there were a lot of orphans after the Korean War. He established what he called boys' towns and girls' towns in Korea, and he established this religious order to help him. And it's an amazing book. Some compare him to Mother Teresa. He's up for canonization. He's considered venerable. He dies relatively young from ALS, but before he dies, he had established this same work in the Philippines and in Mexico. And so I encourage you for your reading. It's called Priest and Beggar, about Father Aloysius Schwartz. You know, as some of you have asked me about how my knee is doing, I had knee surgery just about 3 months ago, knee replacement. I'd like to say it was because I've been kneeling so much in prayer, but I might get stricken. But anyway, thanks for your inquiries. And yeah, I had a good surgeon, a good physical therapist. You know, physical therapists physically are like spiritual directors. Spiritually, they're not really happy unless you're hurting a certain degree. But anyway, the rehab's coming along well. But one of the things during the rehab, one of our priests gave me a copy of The Chosen, which I had heard about. In fact, I had seen one episode, and I wasn't really terribly impressed with the episode that I'd seen. But I watched all of the series as it is to this point, and found it really pretty powerful. You know, it's faithful to the gospel, but it fills in what the creators think might have happened. A lot of the details that the gospel doesn't have, they creatively kind of fill in those details, and it presents the apostles in an interesting way. You know, Matthew he's kind of portrayed as being autistic and an interesting kind of character, but it shows the humanity of the apostles very clearly, and how they don't all get along very well sometimes, and so I found a lot of consolation actually in this portrayal of the apostles. It reminded me when I first got involved with the pro-life movement. It was like in 1985. And I had just been appointed, and we had in St. Louis, we always had an annual convention there. And that year before I was involved, but I came in on the tail end of it, Mother Angelica was the featured speaker at our convention. And I still remember the essence of her talk, because she talked a lot about the apostles, and I think she called them klutzes and blockheads, but she was saying this in reference to herself, how she was totally unqualified to be leading any kind of TV network. She had no credentials for this, and she felt an affinity with the apostles in this. You know, perhaps at some point you might have seen there's a little piece, I'm looking on my notes here, about this, I forget his name, he was a Protestant, but he wrote this thing about Jesus submitting a letter to like a human resource headhunter group, and he gets this response from the headhunters that about the 12 resumes of the apostles that he's sent them, and the letter comes back and says, well, thank you for employing our services, but here's our analysis. Peter is emotionally unstable and has anger issues. Andrew has no leadership qualities. John and James, they're personally interested in self-gain, and this is going to be a problem for loyalty in the group. Thomas is questioning everything. This is going to be bad for morale. Matthew was blacklisted by the Better Business Bureau of Jerusalem. Jesus, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, they said they have radical tendencies and come out high on manic depression. But there is one candidate that they thought showed promise, Judas. And Tim Hansel is the man's name that did this. But again, I think as a successor of the apostles, I take comfort in this. Because there's a pattern here. The Lord likes to use the weak and those that seem unqualified. And for I want to congratulate those that received promotions today. Thank you. Those promotions are indications, yes, that you've been active in the order, but also that you've been very active in your local parishes and your local dioceses. And thank you for being leaders really in your diocese and your parish communities. We congratulate you on that. And for our new investees, sometimes I think you may be thinking, well, how did I wind up with this group? And sometimes, even the titles that we use can be intimidating. But the Lord has a plan. He's called you in some way to be part of this mission of this order, this beautiful order that's devoted to, protecting the Holy Land and making it accessible to the Christian community, helping the Christians that live in the Holy Land, but also, like those original knights, to live heroic lives of faith in trying to help the people of the Holy Land, but help one another in our pursuit of holiness. So thank you for our new investees, for your openness to this, and I think one of the gifts that you'll find is it's going to bring you into association with some amazing people. I happened to meet the actor that plays Jesus in The Chosen, Jonathan Rumi. We were both at an event some months ago now, and it actually was, it was the dinner, it was the closing dinner. He was kind of the featured speaker, and we were sitting at the same table, and they were doing similar. Our group, they had toast as kind of at the conclusion of the meal. And so they were offering this toast. Well, at our table, there were water glasses. And so Jonathan looks at me and says, you want me to change it into wine? I said, you're really getting into method acting here, I think, Jonathan. Yeah, it was interesting to meet him and his portrayal of our Lord. One of the things I like about his portrayal, it shows that the Lord truly had a sense of humor. And some of the things that I think as we read the Gospels, they are filled with a lot of humor if you allow yourself to really visualize what's going on. I'm so grateful for the presentation, both of our presenters today, for Kathy helping us with our prayer life, and Bishop Cousins with his beautiful presentation on this Eucharistic revival. And I would echo his encouragement that as an order, we want to be very much engaged with this, and I encourage you in your diocese and your parishes to get very involved with it. I was visiting one of our parishes just this past week, and it was one of our small town parishes. They actually have a school there that's being recognized as a school of excellence. And we were visiting the classrooms, and one of the teacher, I think she was a 5th grade teacher, and we got into a discussion, and she said, she said, I taught many years in the public schools, and but she went to daily mass even when she was teaching in the public schools. She had this beautiful love for the Eucharist. And she said that she had been offered a job at this Catholic school, but she was trying to discern if that's really what she could do in light of her family circumstances and their needs, but she was praying in adoration, and she said, she heard the Lord say to her, take this job, take this job. And, it was beautiful to hear her say that because, I think sometimes when we think about prayer, we think about what it is that we say to the Lord, what we want to say to the Lord. But prayer, if it's truly what I believe it's called to be, is this conversation between ourselves and the Lord, then it really is, it has to be more than just us speaking to the Lord, but we need to be quiet, and that's why I think adoration can be so powerful in our lives and allow ourselves to listen to what the Lord is trying to reveal to us. And Jesus can do this at all ages. I may have shared this story with you years ago, but it happened some years ago. I was going through my mail. It was about this time of year, and I'd gotten this. Mail is not one of the favorite things I do as a bishop. But it's one of the important things we do. But there was this letter, and it was from a young woman who said she was going into 8th grade, and she had been at our camp that summer. And she says, early in the letter, she says, yes, and I fell in love with this guy at the camp, and I'm going, oh, great. And then she goes on about, she grew up in this Catholic family, and she said we went to Mass every Sunday. We prayed before meals. We prayed before going to bed. But she said, I've always loved going to the camp, but I kind of put up with the religious part of it. But this year, she said, and at our camp, the campers always go to Mass, but they also always have a time in adoration. And she said that year in adoration, she was praying to the Lord. She was asking the Lord, Lord, who do you want me to help? She actually put it, who do you want me to lead? And there was this other young girl there who they had known each other years ago when they were very young, in their first and second grade. They had been good friends. And her friend's mother had died, and the father didn't have the same faith life as the mother, and so she didn't go to the Catholic school. They didn't stay in touch, but they were kind of brought together again at this camp. And she said while she was praying in front of the Blessed Sacrament, the Lord said, I want you to reach out to this friend years ago. I want you to pray for her and pray that to ask her mother to intercede for her. And she talks to this friend, and after this experience, and she finds out her friend was having kind of the same experience in adoration. And after that, once the camp was over, they started going to daily Mass. This was towards the end of the summer, and they were going to the Adoration Chapel at the parish daily. And she says, well, you're probably wondering why this 13-year-old girl's writing to you about her love life, but I fell in love with Jesus. That's who I fell in love with at camp this year. So that makes reading the mail worthwhile when you get letters like that. But it also was instructive to me that just how powerful adoration can be, and how at very young ages, and I'm really encouraged in some of our schools how they're working to bring young children to learn to spend time in adoration. And I know many of you, this is an important part of your spirituality already, and I hope these words are just encouraging to you, but also, if it's not part of your spiritual life, to make that an important part of your spirituality as well. I was really taken with what Bishop Cousins was saying too about understanding the Mass as a sacrifice. And some years ago, I think I shared with you my favorite book that year was From Fire by Water, which was written by this Sohrab Ahmari, who was somebody He had grown up in Iran. He and his mother and father were divorced, and he and his mother emigrated to the United States, wound up living in Salt Lake City. But he wasn't really a devout Muslim. He had kind of, by that time, had kind of rejected Islam. But he admired the Islamic martyrs that he had learned about when he went to the Muslim schools. But when he comes to the United States, he becomes very secularized. He loses any kind of faith at all. He immerses himself in the American culture and pursuit of pleasure and material things. But he comes to a point in his life, he's in New York City. He had been there for a conference with his business at a time he's in his early 20s. And he said he was at the train station, but he had a couple hours to kill, and he started walking around the block, and he was kind of really disappointed and disgusted in many ways with his own life at that time. And he wanders into a Catholic church that was near Grand Central Station in New York, and Mass is just beginning as he goes in. And he doesn't really know what's going on. He sits in the back of church, but when it comes to the time of the Eucharistic prayers, he hears the words of the Eucharistic prayers, and he has no idea what the priest is holding up when he sees him holding up this little white disc. But he recognizes in the words of those prayers that they're talking about a sacrifice, of sacrificial giving. It reminded him of the Islamic martyrs, that they're talking about, our prayers at that point are talking about this great heroic sacrifice that Jesus does for us. And, I think, again, I love what Bishop Cousins was saying, that when we really engage in the Eucharist, if we understand that, what we're experiencing, how what Jesus did on Calvary is being made present to us at this time. And one of the images that came to me as he was speaking when we received the Lord in the Eucharist, and when he was talking about Mary at the foot of the cross, it's almost at those beautiful depictions that we see of the Pietà. It's the sacrifice Jesus coming to us at that moment, which is this powerful expression of God's love for us, but then calling us to follow him in this way of heroic and sacrificial love. So I'm very hopeful about what this Eucharistic revival can mean for our church in the United States, for our diocese, for our parish communities, but for all of us individually as well. I also appreciated Bishop Cousins' references to Pope John Paul, and I didn't realize he had this skill of knowing how to get close to the Pope, but it reminded me of something I was going to share with you. John Paul, was an amazing influence, I think, on so many of our lives, and I was privileged to be able to be in Rome in 1998. I had just become a bishop in September of 97, and the bishops of the United States were in the process the next months of making these ad limina visits. Ad limina means to the threshold, and it's a visit that is supposed to happen every 5 years, but usually popes get behind time, so it's usually longer than 5 years between these visits. And they call it ad limina because part of the pilgrimage is to go to the threshold, which that's what ad limina means, to the threshold of the tombs of the great apostles Peter and Paul, and to pray there that we bishops will have the same apostolic zeal that Peter and Paul had, and to meet with the successor of Peter. Well, it happened, our visit, our region, Region 9, which is Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, and Nebraska, the bishops from there, we were there in June, and it coincided with the Feast of Corpus Christi. And we were invited to go to the Corpus Christi procession. And one of the things that John Paul had done at the beginning of his ministry as Pope, and therefore as the Bishop of Rome, was to try to revive the Eucharistic procession in the Diocese of Rome. And so he celebrated a Mass outside of St. John Lateran's. If you've been to Rome, the piazza outside was in the early evening. He celebrated this Mass. And then after the Mass, there was a procession that went from St. John Lateran to another basilica, St. Mary Major. Now, in 1998, even by that time, the Pope's health was compromised in some ways, and his mobility mainly was impaired. But for the procession, they had the monstrance with the Blessed Sacrament on. It was like a very decorated flatbed truck with an altar on it, and the monstrance affixed to this altar, and the Pope was kneeling on a prie-dieu in front of the Blessed Sacrament, while the rest of us processed, and the bishops, we were all given these big candles to carry. I think I still have wax on one of my cassocks from that event. But I remember when we got to St. Mary Major, and the deacon took the monstrance down and put it on the altar outside of St. Mary Major, so we're in the piazza there. And John Paul, much like what Bishop Cousins said, John Paul goes and he literally drops to his knees, and you could see the pain that he experienced in doing this. But again, it was such a powerful example of his devotion to the Eucharist. And he would write at the end of his papacy, his last encyclical was an encyclical on the Eucharist. And that's where, our theme for the conference, the term Eucharistic amazement, was really a term that he coined. And he said that he wanted to revive within the whole church this Eucharistic amazement. And he talks in there about how some of the great fathers of the church, and I think it was Ignatius of Antioch, might have been Irenaeus, but one of the fathers, they talked about the Eucharist as being an antidote for death and a medicine for immortality. So think about those words, an antidote for death, a medicine for immortality. And what would we do to get an antidote for death and this medicine for immortality? And so I think the church in the United States at this time is really inviting all of us to recover just a wonder and awe at this God who would make himself present to us in the Eucharist. As you know, I've been involved in the pro-life movement a long time, and when I was telling Bishop Cousins afterwards, I'm so grateful that his mother gave him birth. And because there's an article, you can find it, I think, on the internet that talks about Monster Baby Becomes Bishop. It's got some title like that. Because during the pregnancy, she was told that this child was going to have all sorts of deformities and was encouraged to consider an abortion. And thank God his mother never would consider that, but was a great woman of faith. But he's a monster bishop, but in a different way. But I think when I think about this God who would become an embryo in the womb of Mary, and then would allow himself to be born in these incredibly humble and stark conditions of Bethlehem, who would grow up in this obscure town of Nazareth and spend most of his adult life as a laborer, as a carpenter, would exercise his ministry again in terms of worldly powers at that time was considered a very insignificant region of the world, and then would eventually go to Jerusalem there to go through his passion and his death on Calvary, so that you and I would know the depth of God's love for us, and so that you and I could receive the Lord's mercy. And then on Easter would defeat death and invite us to share in his life, eternal life. That this God who would make himself present to us in this way, that we shouldn't be surprised that Jesus would figure out a way to make himself present to his disciples through all time. And not just to the disciples at that particular time, but to make himself present through all time. And that he would do this in very humble visual appearance, in this simple piece of unleavened bread and this cup of what previously was wine becoming his precious blood. And this is, at the heart of our Catholic spirituality. It's the great gift of our faith, this incredible outpouring of the Lord's love and making himself present to us in this way. So I encourage you to, to get involved in your diocese and your parishes with this Eucharistic revival. I think it's going to be a very important moment in the life of our church here in the United States. And I think it's going to bring many fruits and blessings to our country. I just want to share for a moment, of course, with regard to the pro-life movement. As you know, that's been an important part of my ministry. And in Kansas, we had a very disappointing outcome on a ballot issue there. We were the first state to have a ballot issue after the Dobbs decision, where the U.S. Supreme Court, amazingly, and after almost 50 years of labor by many of you and others in the pro-life effort and lots of prayer, corrected the decisions that they made in 1973 and reversed Roe versus Wade and returned now to the states this ability for us to determine public policy. And that was, if you noted it, the decision came down on the Feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which I was really grateful that the Supreme Court consulted our liturgical calendar when they decided to issue this landmark decision. But I think and this is an amazing event. For one, I doubted that I would ever see that day come, and to think about the constellation of events that made that possible. I was talking to a politician recently who was just saying, that he didn't think Amy Coney Barrett could have been confirmed in any other time frame, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies at this moment where the presidential election is just months away, and that I think the president and his allies were afraid to come down too harsh in the confirmation hearings at that time. And so it's amazing what came together to make that decision happen. But as you all know, it's not the end of the pro-life struggle. In many ways, it's a new beginning, and that struggle is going to become even more intense in our time. And we experienced that in Kansas. It was sad that we were defeated, but it was shocking that we were defeated by the margin that we were. And I attribute it to because our opponents, it's harder to get a yes vote for a constitutional amendment than a no vote, because if people are confused, they'll vote no, saying we'll stick with what we know rather than what might be. And our opponents were very good at confusing people about the nature of the amendment. Probably the ballot language could have been written better. But they also were very good, and the national media, and of course the local secular media, were spreading a lot of fear at this time, talking about things like women with ectopic pregnancies would not be able to get treated, women with miscarriages would not be able to get correct care. I mean, all of this crazy talk, really, but it affected people. It created a fear in people. And so I think this battle now turns to all of the states, and I just encourage you to do your part in being involved with this. And we need to become well-educated ourselves. And a lot of education on the sanctity of life doesn't happen in public meetings and talks, but happens over kitchen tables and in family gatherings and with neighbors, or just conversations with coworkers. And so each of us has a part to play in helping our people to realize that what is at stake here in our culture and our society today. Will we be a culture that doesn't believe it can live without a so-called right to kill our own children? I mean, that's really what it gets down to. That there, with 50 years of legalized abortion, there's a significant portion of our population that doesn't think we can survive without the right to kill our own children. This is so sad, but it's a moment, I think, where we have an opportunity, and we have a window of opportunity to re-catechize our people. And I was recently, and some of you were there, I was recently at an event in St. Louis, actually in St. Charles, Missouri, for Missouri Right to Life. And one of the featured speaker, I was on the program, but not the featured speaker, was Tim Tebow, the football player. And you know, there were protesters outside of the arena of where the event was being held, the conference center. And I read about, just recently, about how at another, it was an event for like an organization that was helping provide alternatives for abortions, and how pro-abortion individuals had infiltrated the event and became volunteers for an event and then disrupted the event. And but Tim Tebow said, you know, he had some people that were accompanying him. He actually had said he had asked his aides that were with him to go out and serve refreshments to the people that were protesting. And he said an important point. He says, these are not our enemies. These individuals that we strongly disagree with their viewpoint, but they too are, Jesus Christ gave his life on Calvary for them, that there is such worth in the eyes of God that a God would die for them. And so we need to, they're not our enemies. They are those in need of conversion. And it's only by the witness of our lives that others should be able to see in us something that attracts them to want to come to know this God who fills us with joy and peace, even in the midst of all the difficulties of our life, who fills us with a compassion that would make us care about people thousands of miles away in the Holy Land, or care about a woman that's in a difficult pregnancy and want to surround her with love. It's our witness of being filled with the gospel of life and this understanding of God's incredible love and mercy that we've experienced in our lives that can really transform our culture and our society today. And so I think that's why this Eucharistic revival is so important. We need to renew the faith within the church itself. We need to live the gospel with greater passion and greater authenticity. And when the gospel's lived well, it's attractive. It's contagious. I tell our young people sometimes it's more contagious than COVID-19 if we live the gospel well. And our job is to infect the world with the truth and the beauty of God's love revealed in Jesus Christ. And if we do that, you know, I think all of these other cultural problems will come into focus, and we'll be able to restore to our country not only a respect for the life of the unborn, but a respect for all of human life at all of its different stages and circumstances. And that's, you know, at the heart of the mission of the church. So thank you all. Thanks for being part of this order, for being willing to give your time and your energy to share your resources, to help us help the people in the Holy Land. But most of all, thank you for your commitment to your own Catholic faith and your desire to follow Jesus and to be his disciple, and the way that you do that in your marriages and your families, in your professional life. Thank you for striving to be true knights and dames who believe in the cross of Jesus Christ and the incredible love that it signifies. Thanks.